They say some are born great, some achieve greatness, and some have greatness thrust upon them. For Sir Christopher Lee, it wasn't so much thrust upon as it was force-fed with a silver spoon while the universe held a royal banquet in his honour. Over his improbably long and ridiculously eventful life, Lee didn't so much stumble upon important people and events as he crashed into them like an uncoordinated ninja with an anomalously perfect timing. Wherever he went, history decided, you know what, let's make him the main character of this chapter too. By sheer cosmic design, Lee leveled up through life like an ultra-rare rank hero in a gacha game. No rerolls needed. A fencing duel? Done it. Heavy metal albums? Nailed it multiple times. Starring in blockbuster films and befriending Tolkien himself? Child's play. The man was quite literally a walking Easter egg for human achievement. As there was almost nothing he hadn't done at least once. Probably twice for good measure. Sir Christopher Frank Carandini Lee entered the world on 27th of May 1922 in Belgravia, London, as if born directly onto a red carpet rolled out by destiny itself. His father, one Lieutenant Colonel Geoffrey Trollope Lee, was a Boer War and World War I veteran, and his mother, Countess Estelle Marie Carandini di Sassano, came preloaded with so much aristocratic flair she practically sneezed coat of arms designs. For context, her family wasn't just noble, they were historically fencing noble. She could trace her lineage directly to King Charlemagne, the first Holy Roman Emperor, which is basically like saying, yeah, I'm in the OG Royal Hall of Fame. Oh, and the family owned roughly to 80 to 90% of the Empire's coat of arms, you know, as you do. As a result, Christopher's childhood was less playing in the mud and more networking with history books and human form. He rubbed shoulders with figures like Prince Yusupov of France and Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich of Russia, better known as Rasputin's assassins. Yes, little Christopher's playdates involved tea, biscuits, and swapping, so remember when we killed that mystical Russian guy? Stories. At 4, Christopher's life hit its first plot twist. His parents split and he moved to Switzerland, where he starred as Rumpelstiltskin in preschool, a perfect warm-up for a lifetime of playing scary dudes. After returning to England, he attended Ragnar's private school, then gained a new stepfather, Hankor George St. Croix Rose, who is in fact the uncle to Ian Fleming, because Lee's life was already a crossover episode. After failing to get into Eton, thanks to his tragic math skills, 11th place on the exam, ouch. And with his stepdad unwilling to fund the tuition, little Christopher landed at Wellington College, where he mastered Latin, ancient Greek, and a buffet of modern languages, including French, Spanish, Italian, German, Greek, Russian, and Swedish. Basically, if you spoke it, Christopher Lee could answer you in perfect grammar with an intimidating stare. Despite this success, Christopher Lee's college experience wasn't exactly a stroll through the quad. In fact, he was beaten so often under the guise of corporal punishment that he once got beaten for being beaten too much. If there was a record for disciplinary whacks, Christopher was probably on the leaderboard. And so, between the beatings, he endured endless marching and weapons training, which he despised almost as much as math. With his knack for languages, everyone assumed he'd become a diplomat, because what else do you do when you can charm people in 8 languages? But fate had other plans. In 1939, at just 17, he left school when his stepdad went bankrupt, cutting short his academic and multilingual ambitions. Turns out, diplomacy's loss was the world's gain. After leaving college, Christopher Lee spent a month job hunting before deciding, forget it, I need a holiday. He went to the French Riviera to crash with his older sister, where he accidentally witnessed history, the last public execution in France on June 17, 1939. True to his unflappable nature, Lee turned away at the exact moment the guillotine fell, letting him keep his cool and his head through the whole affair. Strangely, this wouldn't be his first brush with capital punishment trivia. Lee had a macabre fascination with executions afterwards, and could eventually name every royal executioner since the 15th century, which is admittedly a rather niche party trick. He also enjoyed frequent trips to Scotland Yard's crime museum. Grim? Sure, but hey, everyone needs a hobby, right? Later, Lee stayed with an exiled Russian princely family in Menton, France, because of course he did. However, with World War II on the horizon, he decided it was time to swap French palaces for good old British safety. So, back in England, Lee earned £1 a week, which is about £250 today, as a shipping clerk, a gig that naturally set him on the path for his long military career. Why start small when your life is an epic, eh? While working at the shipping company, Christopher Lee decided to partake in the ultimate rite of passage for a young man, the infamous lad's holiday. Unlike most lads though, his idea of a getaway involved heading to Finland in 1939 to fight communists in the Winter War. One small hiccup. Neither Lee nor his mates knew how to ski. Despite being a crack shot with a rifle, their lack of slope skills relegated them to guard duty far from the front lines. Basically, Finland's way of saying thanks, but no thanks. A few weeks later, the Brits were politely sent home, leaving Lee to briefly return to his clerk job. But Lee wasn't one to let little things like inexperience hold him back. In 1940, after his father's death, he joined the RAF, or Royal Air Force, training to become a pilot. Things were going well until his optic nerve damage that he got at some point caused blackouts and blood vision, grounding him for good. After flying off the table, the RAF handed him logistical work, which was about as thrilling as it sounds. Still determined to fight for his country, Lee pivoted to RAF intelligence. His knack for taking initiative impressed his superiors, leading to assignments with the British South African Police, prison work, and later postings in South Africa and Egypt. While serving in the North African campaign, he narrowly avoided death when the airfield he was stationed at was bombed, because of course his life couldn't stay boring for long. In May 1943, after the Axis surrendered in North Africa, Christopher Lee moved to Libya for the Allied invasion of Sicily, bouncing between Malta and various Sicilian towns. By winter, his adventures took a brief pause when he landed in the hospital in Carthage, his 6th bout of malaria that year being the reason. Bloody 6. At this point, it was less a disease and more of a recurring subscription. Once recovered, he returned to his post only to find his men on the brink of mutiny. The reason being, they were cut off from the news of the Eastern Front, mail from home, and, most importantly, alcohol. Yes, the lack of booze was apparently the last straw. Priorities, right? But you can't blame them. Booze was pretty important back then. Fortunately, Lee's legendary charisma talked them down, and by July he was promoted to flying officer, despite the minor technicality that he still couldn't fly. In late 1943, Lee was reassigned to the army, where he fought at Monte Cassino with the 8th Indian Infantry Division and the Bloody Gurkhas. Naturally, he almost died, this time while trying to help after a plane crash, only to trip over a live bomb. Luckily, the bomb chose not to ruin the day. He must have given Lady Luck a good time in bed because she kept coming back for more. Because life wasn't thrilling enough, Lee later took some time off in Naples, where he climbed Mount Vesuvius, and 3 days later, it erupted. Because when you're Christopher Lee, even a volcano can't resist joining your story. As an intel officer, Christopher Lee was attached to 2 elite units: the Long Range Desert Group, precursors to the legendary SAS, and the Special Operations Executive, aka the Ministry of Ungentlemanly Warfare. Lee was famously tight-lipped about his experiences in these units, famously saying, "I was attached to the SAS from time to time, but we are forbidden, former, present, or future, to discuss any specific operations. Let's just say I was in Special Forces, and leave it at that." And people really ran with that. Speculation and embellishment turned Lee's military career into a legendary mystery, one he never confirmed or denied, further building his mystique. He was so committed to keeping the secrets of his military service that whenever a journalist tried to pry, he'd have a little fun with them. Leaning in, he'd ask, "Can you keep a secret?" Naturally, they'd nod eagerly, thinking they were about to score the scoop of the century. So Lee would smile, lean back, and reply, "So can I." In fact, he was such a troll that when one journalist, Terry Morgan, once asked if Lee was a spy, Lee stood up, looking around dramatically and deadpanned, "Do you really think I'd blend inconspicuously into a crowd if I were a spy?" Legendary, right? Just another day in the life of Sir Trolls-a-Lot himself. In April 1945, Christopher Lee joined the Central Registry of War Criminals and Security Suspects, hunting down high-ranking Nazis. True to form, he kept things vague, saying, "We got dossiers, interrogated them, and handed them over. We saw concentration camps, some cleaned up, some not." Later, he admitted in another interview, "I've seen dreadful things, real horror and blood," and confessed that after seeing enough death and destruction, you develop a shell, or as Lee put it, you had to, otherwise we'd never have won. Lee retired from the RAF in 1946 as a flight lieutenant, despite never flying. He carried his military ID post-war to waltz into police and military HQs like it was his personal VIP pass for government security. While attached to elite units like the Long Range Desert Group and the Special Operations Executive, Lee wasn't technically in the Special Forces. His job was intel, briefing, debriefing, and sharing information. The secrecy around his role and the lack of records have turned his wartime exploits into legend, with rumors of Nazi hunting and daring missions that Lee neither confirmed nor denied. If the tales were exaggerated, Lee wasn't to blame. He simply refused to spill the truth, letting the mystery grow. That was just classic Christopher Lee and standard operating procedure. After World War II, Christopher Lee decided desk jobs weren't for him. Over lunch, his cousin, Count Niccolo Carandini, the British ambassador, casually suggested, "Why not become an actor?" Conveniently, Lee's great-grandparents had founded an opera company, so performing was literally in his blood. However, Lee's mother was horrified, declaring, "Think of the disgrace. Think of the appalling people you'll work with." Classic reverse psychology, Lee immediately dove into acting. He joined the rank company of youth, where his first lessons in the glamorous world of showbiz involved cleaning the stage and holding cue cards. Humble beginnings, even for a man destined to be Count Dracula. Once he'd graduated from stage mopping, Lee sought film roles, but his towering 6'5" frame made directors nervous. Many early parts involved him sitting down because cramming him into a shot was, quite literally, a bit of a tall order. Christopher Lee also had a fascinating connection to royalty that is less widely known, but certainly an interesting story. In the same year he went back to acting. He was once romantically involved with Princess Irene of the Netherlands, and while it has a unique story behind it, they never actually married. Lee and Princess Irene met in the early part of the 1950s, and their relationship became serious enough that they were considering marriage. According to various accounts, Lee had the blessing of Princess Irene's father, King Willem Alexander of the Netherlands, though he wasn't yet king at the time, since his father was the reigning monarch. This was not a casual romance, but a relationship with potential royal consequences, as Lee would have needed official approval from the Dutch royal family, given Princess Irene's status. However, the relationship ultimately didn't lead to marriage. One of the key reasons for this was Princess Irene's decision to marry Prince Carlos Hugo of Bourbon-Parma, a member of the Spanish royal family. This choice reportedly caused a rift with her family, particularly her mother, Queen Juliana of the Netherlands, who did not approve of the union because Carlos Hugo was seen as politically problematic due to his connection with Spain's Francoist regime. Though Lee and Princess Irene parted ways, the romantic connection and the royal blessing had an intriguing and almost fairy tale-like chapter to his life. Christopher Lee, while being known as a towering figure in horror cinema, was indeed someone who moved in circles far beyond the usual celebrity world at that time, navigating relationships with royalty, nobility, and global icons throughout his life. Lee spent many years playing bit parts, often uncredited, in films like Hamlet and Moulin Rouge from 1952, which meant his career was less rising star and more background furniture. To get noticed, he said yes to every role, even embellishing his qualifications. This occasionally backfired, as on the set of Quo Vadis from 1951, when asked if he could drive a chariot, Lee confidently claimed he was licensed for all vehicles. Spoiler warning, he wasn't. Driving a chariot, essentially a glorified dustbin pulled by two aggressive horses, turned out to be very different from driving a car. Let's just say his chariot career was short-lived. In 1951, after all that Spanish royal drama, Christopher Lee's career seemed stuck, but fate intervened during a casual trip to Stockholm, as, while humming to himself, as one does, his powerful baritone caught the ear of Jussi Björling, the greatest opera singer of that era. Björling approached him and asked, "You have the voice, what are you doing with it?" Lee briefly trained in opera, developing the vocal chops that would later define his magnetic speaking and singing voice. However, Lee decided that acting offered more opportunities for storytelling, shelving his operatic ambitions. That passion, though, never fully faded, and decades later, Lee combined his dramatic flair with his love for music to create heavy metal albums about Charlemagne, because of course he did. After dodging a life in opera, Lee went back to slogging through uncredited roles in films like Moulin Rouge 1952 and The Crimson Pirate from the same year. While these parts didn't make him famous, Lee earned a reputation for his towering presence and professionalism. Then, in 1957, Hammer Film Productions came knocking, offering Lee his big break in The Curse of Frankenstein. As Frankenstein's creature, he didn't need to say a word. His physicality did all the acting for him. More importantly, the role paired him with Peter Cushing, sparking a lifelong friendship and iconic on-screen partnership. A year later, Hammer Films gave Lee the role that would define his career, Count Dracula in Dracula 1958. His Dracula wasn't the stiff, aristocratic vampire of old, but a magnetic, menacing force of nature, dripping with both elegance and terror. The performance launched Lee into stardom, proving that even if the Count avoided sunlight, Lee's star was definitely on the rise. So, between 1952 and 1958, Lee transformed from a struggling actor into a horror icon. Whether playing monsters or mesmerizing audiences as Dracula, he proved that with persistence, talent, and a little help from fate, even the tallest guy in the room could stand out. Christopher Lee's reign at Hammer Films solidified him as the king of gothic horror. He embodied unforgettable villains like the Mummy in 1959 and Rasputin in Rasputin the Mad Monk 1966. His commanding presence and intensity captivated audiences. His on-screen rivalry with Peter Cushing became a hallmark of Hammer's success, even as the two shared a close friendship off-camera. But Lee wasn't just a master of monsters. He explored his versatility in films like The Devil's Daffodil, 1961, and The Face of Fu Manchu, 1965, proving he could shine beyond horror's shadow. Yet Hammer's obsession with sequels began to frustrate him. By the time Dracula Prince of Darkness 1966 rolled around, Lee was so fed up with the scripts that he refused to utter lines he felt insulted the character. Dracula hissed and snarled instead, but Lee's frustration with repetition was clear. As such, branching out, Lee took on international and unconventional projects like The Castle of Fu Manchu in 1969 and Theatre of Death in 1967. He was eager to leave Hammer's gothic castles behind and explore new creative horizons. His work hinted at a future filled with layered and complex roles, setting the stage for one of his most iconic performances in The Wicker Man 1973. By 1970, Hammer's heyday was fading, but Lee's career was far from over. With his deep voice, towering stature, and magnetic screen presence, he was already a legend of horror. But the restless spirit that fueled his ambition promised there was so much more to come. So, from then on, from 1970 to 1980, Christopher Lee embarked on a bold reinvention, leaving Hammer's gothic gloom behind to prove he was more than just Dracula's shadow. He wore the Count's cape for the last time in The Satanic Rites of Dracula 1973. delivering a performance as commanding as ever, even as he privately despaired over the franchise's decline. This farewell wasn't just an exit, it was an exorcism. Lee severed ties with Hammer, ready to conquer new horizons. His breakout came with The Wicker Man in 1973, where he shed his horror typecast as Lord Summerizel, a sinister pagan leader. A haunting performance in a psychological horror masterpiece, it showcased his ability to deliver nuance and complexity. Hollywood soon took notice, casting him as Francesco Scaramanga in The Man with the Golden Gun in 1974. As Bond's charming yet lethal nemesis, complete with a third nipple, like in the books, Lee was magnetic, balancing suaveness with menace. Around the same time, he swashbuckled into The Three Musketeers in 1973, and its sequel as the villainous Count Rochefort, proving his talent extended beyond shadows and stakes. Lee's ambition took him to television, surprising fans on Saturday Night Live with sharp comedic timing and a flair for self-parody. Meanwhile, his unmistakable baritone lent gravitas to narration and audiobooks, hinting at his later adventures in music. On screen, he dabbled in mad scientists, supernatural overlords, and eccentric characters in films like House of the Long Shadows in 1980. By decade's end, Lee had shattered the chains of typecasting. He was no longer just horror royalty, but a versatile chameleon, thriving in blockbusters, historical dramas, and even comedy. The 1970s had tested his resilience, and Lee emerged victorious, ready to redefine himself again in the years to come. His gothic past lingered like a shadow, but the future promised even greater triumphs. In his 80s, Lee began working on a series of heavy metal albums. The first, Charlemagne by the Sword and the Cross, won him the Spirit of Metal Award at Metal Hammer's 2010 Golden God Awards. Hammer interviewed him alongside metal icon Tony Iommi backstage at the show. That album was followed by 2013's Charlemagne, The Omens of Death. In 2014, at 92, Lee released an EP called Metal Night, a series of metal covers of old standards such as My Way and The Impossible Dream from Don Quixote. During an audience QA, Lee is asked whether it was true that he owned one of the world's largest collection of occult books. "I don't," Lee interjects. "Somebody wrote that I had 20,000 books. I don't. I'd have to live in a bath." Addressing the rumor later, Lee says, "I don't have a big library of the occult, no. Look, the internet and the media, if they can't think of something to do, they invent it. If they can't think of something to say, they invent it. I don't know who thought that one up. Looks good in print, I suppose, but it's not true." Lee states that his collection of occult books is maybe 4 or 5, and rattles off a couple of innocuous titles, including a copy of the 1934 horror novel The Devil Rides Out, signed by author Dennis Wheatley. In 1968, Lee starred in a movie of the same name, based on that book. He also names a biography of Wheatley, titled The Devil is a Gentleman, The Life and Times of Dennis Wheatley. Lest anybody still harboured suspicions that Lee was some latter-day Aleister Crowley, he continues, "I have met people who claim to be Satanists, who claim to be involved with black magic, who claim that they not only knew a lot about it, but as I said, I certainly have not been involved, and I warn all of you, never, never, never. You will not only lose your mind, you lose your soul." He had a similar interview in 1975. Finally, in 2001, he was made Commander of the British Empire, and was knighted in 2009 by Queen Elizabeth II. Lee died at the Chelsea and Westminster Hospital on 7th of June 2015 at 8:30 am, after being admitted for respiratory problems and heart failure, shortly after celebrating his 93rd birthday there. His wife delayed the public announcement until 11th of June in order to break the news to their family. As a side note, however, a few other things he's done include collaborating with Zena Schreck, daughter of Anton LaVey and High Priestess of Seth, in Christopher Lee Sings Devils, Rogues and Other Villains, from Broadway to Bayreuth and beyond, and is known to have won 3 Guinness Book of World Records, one for being the most connected actor living, most films with a sword fight, and finally, being the tallest actor with a leading role. This has been the life, story, and history of Christopher Lee. Thank you for listening.